Hello, this video will be about Jean-Paul Sartre's essay, Colonialism is a System. One of the important things about this particular article is moving from the existentialist emphasis on the individual, analyzing individual consciousness and our relationship to others and within an immediate situation, to a structural or systematic analysis of the socioeconomic conditions that underlie the situation of individuals, or that overlay, perhaps, is actually a better term. So what is that systematic context that situates people in the world? And of course, in the 1950s particularly, and in the 1960s, both Sartre and Beauvoir would become very active in anti-colonial politics within France, particularly in relation to Algeria. So we will turn and look at Sartre's preface to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth before we look at Fanon, particularly in Black Skin, White Masks. So it's good to have Sartre's sort of understanding of colonialism as a system, as this essay is titled. So he immediately starts with this idea of mystification, which is something that we also see in Beauvoir, especially in the Ethics of Ambiguity, when she talks about mystification in relationship to oppression, particularly the mystification of the oppressed, that sort of lulls them into accepting or resigning themselves to conditions under which they are oppressed, in which their freedom is denied to them in important and ways that are very difficult to sort of negotiate out of or to win the oppressor over. So he wants to put readers immediately on their guard against what he calls NeoColonialist Mystification, and he explains NeoColonialists think that there are some good colonists and some very wicked ones, and that it is the fault of the latter that the situation of the colonies has deteriorated. So again, this kind of mystification sort of throws us back into the analysis of individual actions, where we can sort out people, here are the good ones, here are the bad ones. But the whole conceit of colonialism as a system is to say, no, it doesn't work that way. You can't just say, well, here are some good actors and here are some bad actors. It's the system as a whole, the general arrangement of society and its institutions, that's the problem. And no amount of good actors operating within that system is going to change the dynamics such that the system itself becomes good, right? This is the kind of argument that he's going to make within a systematic analysis. So one of the reasons, one of the theoretical reasons, we might say, why Sartre will support Algerian revolution is because the system needs to be overthrown and redesigned. It's not just a matter of rearranging deck chairs or furniture. The whole structure needs to be reorganized, and different people within that structure need to be emphasized. Their interests need to be spoken to. Part of the first few pages of this essay is Sartre giving a historical analysis of how native Algerians and Arab North Africans have been dispossessed, how part of the process of colonialization in Algeria was taking land and implementing a foreign governmental structure on the indigenous population and the Arab population. So here, mystification. So how does one become mystified? You're taken around Algeria, you are obligingly shown the extreme poverty of the people, which is dreadful. You are told about the humiliation the Muslims suffer at the hands of the wicked, so there's the bad colonists. And then, when you are really outraged, they add, that is why the best Algerians have taken up arms. They couldn't take it anymore. If they go about this the right way, you will return home convinced. First, that the Algerian problem is economic above all else, that it's primarily an economic problem. People are in poverty, so if we raise them out of poverty, it's okay. So it's a question of providing by means of judicious reforms food for 9 million people. So we just need to work within the system to distribute food better and alleviate the poverty. Second, that the problem is social. The numbers of schools and doctors must be greatly increased. So then it's, again, just a matter of rearranging furniture within the system. Just increase the number of doctors and schools and so on. And then third, the problem is psychological. You remember de Man and his inferiority complex of the working class. He had discovered at the same time the key to the native character: maltreatment, malnourished, illiterate. The Algerian has an inferiority complex with regard to his masters. It is by acting upon these three factors that he will be reassured. If he eats enough to satisfy his hunger, if he has work and can read, he will no longer suffer the shame of being a subhuman, and he will rediscover that old Franco-Muslim fraternity. But these are sort of non-political views from Sartre's perspective. We are focusing on economics, we're focusing on conditions within the system, but let's not change or address the system. Let's just make sure that goods are redistributed within it, and that will alleviate the problem, and then we can all be friends. We'll rediscover the old Franco-Muslim fraternity. Sartre's argument throughout, and one of the reasons why he goes through the historical analysis at the beginning, is to show that those goals are impossible within the system. The system is designed to disenfranchise the native population, to render them illiterate, to prevent them from accruing land, to actually transfer land from the indigenous population to the colonizers, and so on and so forth, right? So the reforms it's a pipe dream. Within the system as it stands, these goals that the one who is mystified is sold are impossible because of the very structural organization of colonization and colonialism. So forget about politics, he says. It's the abstract. What's the use of voting if you're dying of hunger, and so on and so forth. So that's the argument of mystification that he covers on the first couple of pages, and this is what he's going to be sort of pushing back against as he generates an argument in favor of revolutionary separation, including revolutionary violence against colonizers in France. So we'll have a lot to say, both when we discuss Sartre's preface to Wretched of the Earth and when we talk about Fanon directly, about the role of political violence and how they view it. These are not philosophies of pacifism, right? So there are going to be arguments, political, philosophical, and otherwise, that justify the use of violence in a political context. Okay, so I think that's something that we have to be aware of going into it. We're not going to get a sort of a pacifist, let's all get together and sing Kumbaya kind of philosophical engagement here. He cites the FLN, which is of course the Revolutionary Front, the National Liberation Front, that is organized in Algeria to fight the revolution. There is a military branch of the front, and it is also a kind of a quasi, or what would you want to call it? It has elements of a governmental structure. It's kind of an ad hoc government. The FLN operates sort of as a government within the colony. So of course it's bucking and pushing back against the authority of the French, and it's attempting to provide infrastructure and social goods to the native and Arab population of Algeria without the authority of the French government. So it has this sort of quasi-governmental feel to it, as well as being a military organization that is fighting France. So it's a coalition as well, so there's a lot of things going on with the FLN that we will again talk more about with both Wretched of the Earth, the preface, Sartre's preface, and Fanon himself. He paraphrases the FLN's response: even if we were happy under French bayonets, we would fight. And he says they're right. And even to go further than the FLN, under French bayonets, they can only be unhappy, because a bayonet, of course, you're at knife point. There's always a threat of violence overlying everything that's done, and you're constrained under the bayonet, right? Not constrained through a negotiation or through consent or anything like that. Not constrained through your own free action, but constrained by force and coerced by a kind of force. He says that, of course, colonization is neither a series of chance occurrences nor the statistical result of thousands of individual undertakings. So there again is pushing back against the mystification that says, well, there's some good actors and bad actors, and there are these individuals. It is a system which was put into place around the middle of the 19th century. And again, I discussed some of this history in another video. I will link to that in the details of this one, just about the history of French involvement in Algeria that starts, their occupation starts in 1830, and then the French pacification of Algeria from about 1835, really continuing until 1903, pretty peak high water mark of violence in 1875 and so on. So the next few pages are dealing with the role of the colony in the context of French policy, a French foreign policy. What's the colony supposed to do? And the debates that were carried on about what exactly to do with the colony. Do we resettle veterans there? Is it a penal colony like Australia was? Or what do we do? They attempted to settle after 1848, so in the process of pacification, it would be better to say add unemployed workers, those whose presence worried the forces of law and order. Out of 20,000 laborers transported to Algeria, the majority perished from fever and cholera. The survivors managed to get themselves repatriated. So there was an attempt to make it a kind of a working colony. They wanted to channel to Africa the overflow of European countries, the poorest peasants of France and Spain. For this rabble, quote-unquote rabble, a few villages were created around Algiers. Algiers is a city, the primary sort of populated city, capital of Algeria, the colonial capital of Algeria at the time. So created around Algiers, Constantine and Oran, and most of them are decimated by disease. So we have this idea both of it's like a settlement colony, estates given to demobilized soldiers who had served in the French army, and then a kind of worker colony where peasants are relocated down there to work. And then you have capitalism established. So in 1863 and 1865 there are these companies, the colonial companies, the Bank and Land Credit Society, the Marseille Credit Society, Mokta Iron Ore Company, and the General Maritime Steam Transportation. He lists these particular sort of capitalists. And this is where capitalism, French capitalism itself, becomes sort of colonialist. Like the full apparatus of capitalism is brought to bear on the colony. And Jules Ferry is this theoretician, and he quotes from Ferry and says that, see, it's actually this guy, and not Lenin, who first defines colonial imperialism. This is an interesting debate that can be hashed out among Marxists, exactly why Sartre says this here. In some sense, he's trying to show that the analysis of imperial colonialism is not necessarily a foreign one. It's not just this Bolshevik Lenin and everything who's saying this, but no, our own policymakers and French theoreticians are the ones who are defining the role of capitalism as an imperial one within the colonies. And this is the Ferry, he quotes, it's in the general interest of France, which has always been awash with capital and has exported it to foreign countries in considerable quantities, to consider the colonial question from this angle, from its own national interest and from the one in which it is flush with capital and is exporting it. For countries like ours, which by the very nature of their industry are destined to be great exporters, This question is precisely one of outlets. Where there is political prominence, there is also predominance in products, economic predominance. Maintain French national dominance and enrich its already full coffers even further. So, to do this, though, you can't create industries in the conquered country. It's not to be invested. The capital with which France is awash is not to be invested in underdeveloped countries, because that would be a risk. All investments carry risk. And what colonial imperialism wants to do is eliminate the risk from the mother country or from the colonial power. It wants to see massive returns without any other risk that's typically involved in gambling with your wealth, right? So, Sartre mentions that Ferry is very clear: capital will not leave. It will simply be invested in new industries which will sell their manufactured products to the colonized countries. So the system creates this flow of wealth where there are raw materials extracted from the colony, there are manufactured products in France, and then the manufactured products are sold back to the colony, and so on. So this is the new feature of official colonization. And Pierre Imhoff, in early 1900, stresses this feature. Directly or not, this is a quote from Pierre Imhoff, directly or not, the property of the colonist has come to him gratis from the state, or he has seen concessions granted to him on a daily basis. Before his eyes, the government has made sacrifices for individual interests considerably greater than those it would consent to in older, fully developed countries. The colonial government has to create a market in the colonies for the goods that France is going to sell it. It's extracting wealth from the colony. So where are the colonies going to afford the products that are being sold to them? And so the colonial country has to basically create a market artificially to buy the products back from the mother country, right? So this is the state intervention that's required. What are the sacrifices that the state makes to colonists? The answer is simple. It sacrifices the property of the Muslims, and this is where Sartre begins to talk about that transfer of property and wealth and land, particularly from the native population to French colonists, in order to sort of create this market in the colonies that will buy the manufactured goods that come back from France, to complete the circuit of consumer goods, basically, from raw materials extracted from the colony, the manufactured product from France, and then back that consumer good back to the colony. Exactly. So there's a couple of things going on in this analysis. One, part of pacification, so part of that brutal process of putting down resistance to French colonization in the 1800s is exactly dispossession. So that's where he says, at the beginning, the slightest stir of resistance was used as an excuse to confiscate or sequestrate. Bagaud would say, the land must be good, it is of little importance to whom it belongs. And there, the revolt of 1871 was useful, because you can just take, if you put down the rebellion, you just take their land as a consequence. Here you also start to see the kind of double-edged sword of colonialism, that the colonists will often make an argument, or colonial powers will often make an argument that, well, colonialism is good because it brings civilizing forces to the colony. The indigenous population are like barbarians or something like that. And when we colonize, we bring civilization, and that's what Sartre is talking about with the gift, the so-called gift of our penal code, of our laws. French law being laid down, which of course destroys the legal culture and norms of the place that it is. It supersedes them, and so it wipes away the legal framework that was in place in Algeria at the time. Why all this generosity? There's the question. Why this gift? Okay, so why do we want to give, these indigenous peoples this gift of our law, because tribal property was usually collective and we wanted to fragment it and to allow land speculators to buy it back bit by bit. So when the law comes in and sort of parcels out the land and transfers it into, makes it into private property, what land that was normally held in common is now fragmented and privatized under the new colonial legal code. This is very similar to the process of enclosement that occurred to the commons in places like England and so on. Again, you take massive tracts of land that are owned communally by people, farmers, people who graze livestock on it, and so on. You cut it up and parcel it up and privatize it, and then you enclose it. So people now don't have access to it. People who formerly had access to it under communal agreements no longer have access to that, and that puts their livelihood in jeopardy. So the resources by which they made their living, they could graze their cattle or they could work the land as an agricultural capacity or so on, is now removed from them. So it not only threatens their sort of legal way of life, but it has practical implications for their livelihood as well. And this all comes about through this gift of the legal system that comes in, right? So here that's what he talks about. The large communist states are turned into a jigsaw puzzle of individual properties and so on. And then, of course, you have corruption, sufficient to corrupt one of these beneficiaries, and he would demand a share out. The long and confusing French procedure ruined all co-owners. The traders in European goods then bought the whole lot from them for peanuts. So the fragmented land was parceled out to different indigenous peoples who were trying to work and negotiate how to use this newfound private property in common. And what would happen is that if just one of those people were corrupted or had issues, then there would be claims brought against. Everyone would have to pay them out, for their land and so on. They would get lost in the labyrinth of a foreign legal system. Their legal fees and expenses would go up, and so on and so forth. And then the bank or whoever would appropriate the land, and they would get it very cheap, so they wouldn't even be compensated properly for this newfound gift of their private property and so on. And huge amounts of land are taken up this way. The way that Sartre explains, with each inheritant they made shares which were given to everyone concerned, so everyone who was using the land in common gets a share. Some of these shares were fictitious. The Douar of Harar, the investigating commissioner, found 55 beneficiaries for 8 hectares. So there are overlapping claims on some of the land. There are conflicting interests in the way that the land's parceled up. And again, that brings people into the legal system with which they're unfamiliar, and which brings with it all kinds of fees and lawyers, and that puts people into debt, and then they end up having to sell the land, and then they sell it to, it gets appropriated from them with very little benefit to the people whose land has been expropriated. So with all of these contesting claims over these private parcels of land, it sufficed to corrupt one of these beneficiaries and he would demand a share out. The long and confusing French procedure ruined all the co-owners. The traders in European goods then bought the whole lot from them for peanuts. So, and he begins to discuss the transfer of land. He just gives statistics on the next few pages. And how from 1850 to 1950 there's a huge growth. Colonist territory in 1850 is 15,000 hectares. By 1950 it's 2,703,000. Right? So this is the situation in the transfer of land there. This is the initial phase of colonization that occurs through pacification and the appropriation of land handed over to colonial capitalists. And I'm going to stop this video here, and then we're going to pick up with the move from this initial establishment which is done a little bit more consciously and purposefully in the national interest of France, as Sartre explains. And then we will move to talk about how the system becomes self-perpetuating. So you have the initial push that's a little bit more conscious and purposeful in the way that it's set up in order to enrich France and create the market necessary for French commodities to be sold in the colonies, coupled with the expropriation of indigenous land and the transfer of that wealth over to colonial powers, especially colonial capitalists, and then how from that initial, more intentional setup does the system become self-perpetuating. Again, when it becomes self-perpetuating, this is what Sartre is going to use to push back against this mystification. The system, because of the way that it has been designed, will perpetuate itself whether or not there's good or bad colonists or anything like that. And it implicates the people who are participating in it, so even the good ones become compromised by the system in which they're operating, which is unjust sort of at its roots, right? So this is part of, again, that systematic analysis that Sartre is trying to realize here, in a little bit of a shift away from the former existential emphasis on the individual and their consciousness and their concrete situation, all of that, now to the system that they're embedded in. We still have individuals in sight here, but now we're starting to become more interested in the context and the system, the socioeconomic situation that the individual is embedded in and in which they're trying to operate on the individual level. So we're shifting our focus now onto this more structural and systematic approach. Okay, so we'll pick up in the next video looking at the self-perpetuation of the colonial system. All right, thank you.